All right, man, peace. So many of LeBron James's detractors slash haters love to talk about his disloyalty. I myself have never shied away from quote unquote critiquing LeBron James, what I call assessing LeBron James, due to his feminine manifestations and his incessant need to bring chaos into an environment so that he can feel empowered. But I've always been one to state that, not just for him, but for any player, a major sign of being a three-dimensional thinker, having a ruling class mentality, is embracing mobility. All embracing mobility is accepting change. Change is one of the only constants that we have here in this life. You have to embrace it. But many fans, and really at the behest or at the inspiration of the media and the owners, for some reason, believe in this ideology of loyalty in sports. Why, I don't know. So they had a good conversation about it here on the Stephen A. Smith and Max Kellerman show. Of course, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
Antonietta, thank you. LeBron speaking out on what he perceives to be a double standard between players and front offices, Max. He's always calculated, and I don't mean that as a slight. So what do you think this means for LeBron's future in Cleveland?
In this case, I don't particularly think that he's being calculated. I think that he's just speaking his mind. I believe that he was asked about Blake Griffin, and he shed some light on his own thoughts in regards to this situation, and he was accurate. This is something that people have known for a long time. I have no idea why, especially so-called black sports fans, black male sports fans, want to address or attack LeBron James on him leaving Cleveland in the first place. The reason why he left was because he had the ability to leave. Of course, he wanted to go and team up with other players. He recognized, much like Kevin Durant, that he did not have the leadership ability, nor did he have the horses in Cleveland to win a championship. That was never going to happen there. Many people, unfortunately, struggle with jealousy. And all a jealous person is, as I've already stated, is someone who spends more time focusing on the gifts that someone else has than working on their own. This is why they cannot put themselves in the place of a LeBron James and understand the importance of being able to transition from one location to another, but with taking advantage of opportunities. Because most people who've never tried to sharpen their gifts are not going to have any opportunities presented to them because they've wasted most of their life.
Well, he could be reminding people that his future, his fate is in his own hands, and he will choose and not be tied to a certain location, because until he came around, that's been the tradition in American team sports, specifically.
Now, I did a video on LeBron James and Charles Barkley, and I stated that before LeBron James, you really did not have any great players who broke that paradigm of deciding to leave a location and going to another team. And when I said broke the paradigm, what I meant was truly taking control of your own destiny when people were trying to align you to a franchise. And there were people who made some attempts at a point, and there was some validity to those points. I remember one brother mentioned Shaq leaving, and Shaq did leave an Orlando franchise that expected him to be there for a while. But I think that there was some tension there with Shaq in that franchise. I also don't remember Shaq facing anywhere near the vitriol that LeBron James faced. For those of you who remember that time period, that era, 1996, and I mentioned that year before, that was the year for major free agency in the NBA for the first time, especially in regards to pay scale. Even though they tried to frame the NBA historically as this league where players were all loyal to their teams before LeBron James, in 1996, Michael Jordan flirted with the idea of playing with the New York Knicks, as did Reggie Miller. Of course, Shaq left Orlando to go play with the LA Lakers after Jerry West wooed him and made him understand how much more his career would resonate if he was able to resurrect the LA Lakers. These were all the early manifestations of player mobility. Players who had never conceived of having this type of recourse where they could leave a team and go somewhere else and not be considered the marquee name for a city and a franchise. LeBron James is the one who really has shown the modern day players the light in regards to it being mandatory, not being an option, but it being mandatory that you leave a team if you can find a better situation. This is why it was so important for the NBA to restructure the collective bargaining agreement to really boost up the pay scale for players to incentivize them to stay. And you owe a lot of that to Mr. LeBron James. But yes, there have been players who've left teams before. Like I already stated, Charles Barkley negotiated, or I shouldn't say he negotiated with, he implored his agent, super agent David Falk, to force the trade from Philadelphia to Phoenix, a team that had already won 53 games the year before. Charles Barkley is another player who in that offseason of 1996 left the Phoenix Suns to go play with the Houston Rockets, a team that had beaten him in the playoffs 2 out of the last 3 years, including allowing Houston to come back from down 3-1. So it's laughable to hear Charles Barkley talk about Kevin Durant when he did basically the same thing. He tries to use the excuse that he was old, as if that makes it any better. So it's okay to do it when you're 34, but not when you're 27 or 28. No, it makes you dumber. You go to a better opportunity as soon as you can. You don't wait till you're old. Brothers, in life, it's not about you taking the hard path. It's about you taking the smart path. When you take the smartest path, you deal with whatever hardships come. But you don't purposefully look for the hard road to make yourself feel like you're tougher. That's the idiot's route. Unfortunately, we have a lot of idiots in this society in general, and in the so-called black community in particular, who try to shame intelligent people. And we see that even from the school system. Intelligent black boys and black girls are often shamed by their fellow students because in the households of these other students, they're not encouraged to embrace their cerebral nature. And we see that all the way up into adulthood, especially in the so-called black community. And no, sir, no. You do what you can. You make the most money that you can. You owe loyalty to 2 things, the Most High and your family, not to no damn sports franchise.
In the NBA, Magic or Bird would have never gone to join the enemy the way LeBron did when he joined up with Dwayne Wade, pairing 2 of the best 3 players on earth on the same team with another perennial all-star in Chris Bosh. I understand that, but I agree with LeBron, Stephen A., and I always have. When a GM does it, that's okay. But when a player, because his team won't get him the requisite help he needs to get to the finals or win, when a player actually acts as his own GM, that's a problem, and that's because we've been conditioned.
And that burning of LeBron James's jersey represented him getting lynched. That represented the burning of him. Okay? And like I said, it's unfortunate that so many so-called black male sports fans actually agree with that nonsense. To me, that really is just a reverberation of a lot of the slave mentality that still has trickled down into the psyche of the so-called black male today. That you actually think that you owe some fidelity to a sports franchise. Like, are you kidding me? Give me a fucking break.
People have been conditioned to think if an executive does it, it's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be done. You just stay in your place, worker. But if someone who works for a living takes their fate into their own hands, takes control of their destiny, there's something wrong with that. Don't worry about that. Stay in your lane. That's not for you to decide. And LeBron James changed that, I think. And that did not sit well with some, but I think others are getting used to it. And I think he's absolutely right about it.
Exactly. And to me, that's going to be the greatest legacy of his career. That he has caused this elevation in regards to the business mindset in the NBA athlete to pursue mobility when it suits you. When you're a Steph Curry, you stay with Golden State not because of any sense of loyalty to that region or to the team, but because that's the best option for you. That's why you do it. That's the best option for you and your family. And I guarantee you, a lot of these guys who talk all this shit about loyalty and how LeBron James and Kevin Durant are snakes, while you mopping floors at the hospital, not that there's anything wrong with that, but if another hospital called you up and said, we're going to offer you double to come mop floors at our hospital, your ass is going to pack up your squeegee and your mop and you're going to take your ass over there to that other hospital to make more money and get more vacation time. Okay? And don't come back with, well, the NBA is a competitive sport. All businesses are competitive. The hospital that you're going to from the one that you left is competing with that other hospital. So spare me.
He's 1,000% correct, and he's putting the world on notice that he will make his decision and he won't feel guilty about whatever decision that he makes.
Nor should he. nor should he. Now, once again, when we start to evaluate the all-time great players and we compare LeBron James and people try to compare him to Michael Jordan, well, that's going to count against him. Why is that? Because Jordan was actually able to make it happen in the location that he was at. That's the only time where that issue is a factor as a negative when you're comparing greatness and exploits between two athletes. Jordan did not have to move to win championships. He was able to make it happen in his original team or on his original team. But you also have to give kudos to the front office of the Bulls for bringing in a coach and bringing in certain players that could help him.
It was a 52-year drought before the city of Cleveland was able to capture a championship in any professional sport. He ended that drought by delivering an NBA championship to the city for the first time in more than a half century. So he owes the city nothing. And he wanted to make sure that everybody knows that. From what I'm hearing, in one breath, you have some executives in the league who believe that LeBron James is staying and is going to try to get Chris Paul to depart from Houston to come to Cleveland because obviously, Chris Paul's the godfather of his children and what have you, and they're very close, and that's something that he would love to have happen.
Yes, and I believe that that's more likely to happen than him going to Houston, but you never know. I just don't think that he would mesh well in that Houston style. I don't see him playing well in the D'Antoni system. He's not a three-point shooter. And yes, LeBron James does need more help than Michael Jordan ever needed. So when you're Michael Jordan and you have a front office with a Jerry Krause who's able to draft a Scottie Pippen and a Horace Grant and bring in a Phil Jackson, that's all Michael Jordan needs. He doesn't need to have to play with other all-time greats, even though Scottie Pippen is a borderline all-time great player. As a defender, he's all-time great, but overall, I would put him in the top 50, but I wouldn't put him in the top 20 or 30. But LeBron James, he just needs more overall talent because of the fact that his style of play is not as malleable as a Michael Jordan's was. Everything has to focus around LeBron. Michael's able to dominate even in a triangle offense. And once again, that's why Jordan is greater than him. That's why it's not a conversation.
There are others that tell me that LeBron James will end up in Houston with James Harden and Chris Paul as opposed to Chris Paul coming to Cleveland. So we don't know what that story is. But Max Kellerman, I also agree with you for the biggest reason of all. Let's just call it what it is. LeBron James doesn't want to say it, so I'll say it for him.
Well, before Stephen A. says it, let me also say this about the LeBron James-Chris Paul situation. I do think that it's more reasonable for Chris Paul to go to Cleveland to play with LeBron than LeBron to come to Houston because I don't think that LeBron matches up with their style of play. But I really don't think either one is going to happen. I don't think either one is going to happen. I think it's more reasonable, but it's more realistic that LeBron would most likely end up in Houston because I don't think that Chris Paul's leaving Houston. I don't think that LeBron would fit in well with Houston. I think that LeBron is going to end up either on San Antonio or one of the LA teams. But we'll see. If LeBron does go to Houston, we'll get to see another aspect of his game. We'll see.
African-American players are held to a different standard. The reality is that in the sport of football and basketball, you're expected to be appreciative of your position. How dare you take the bull by the horn and take control of your own future? If you do so, you are labeled disloyal and what have you.
Well, people like you, Mr. Stephen A. Smith, you play a heavy role in that. You came down and castigated Kevin Durant. You also were one of the people who castigated LeBron when he first left Cleveland. So a lot of you media personalities have a lack of self-awareness. And you only gain an understanding of how silly you were down the line when you could look back and you can have that level of perspective. Unfortunately, in real time, you tend to not have it because you buy into the loyalty in sports paradigm, which is not relevant. It never was. There's never been loyalty in sports. So to me, that question is it's a red herring.
And we're usually talking about African-American players when they go that route, because you're talking about individuals who, by and large, come from impoverished backgrounds. And as a result, people believe that because of the privileged position that they're in, it ain't their talents, it ain't their greatness, it's the privilege that they had of being lucky and fortunate enough to be in these situations to make this amount of money. They should therefore recognize the level of appreciation that they should have and act accordingly.
Look, I'm on record as stating, particularly in regards to Stephen A. Smith, but Chris Carter, he loves to talk about how much of a privilege it is to have played in the NFL. I've stated numerous times on this channel, how could it be a privilege to play in the NFL when as a so-called black man, you represent 6% of the U.S. population, allegedly 6%, but you make up 70% of the NFL and 75% of the NBA. It's obvious to me that the privilege is on behalf of the NFL and the NBA to have you. It's not a privilege for you to be there. It's a privilege for them to have you. That's clear. Because for the percentage to be that stark, the disparity between the percentage of so-called black men in America to be that low, as opposed to the percentage of blacks in professional football and basketball to be that high, it's clear that they're targeting you because they view you as the best athlete.
Black players are held to a different standard, and on far too many occasions, anytime they do something that deviates from what we're accustomed to seeing as it pertains to institutional control, and they exhibit a maverick kind of tendency, and they step out and step forward and remind the world that they've earned the right to make their own decisions and what have you, we sit up there and we label them in a different way. Now, this is entirely different. Kevin Durant, all that stuff with Golden State. I was talking about the team he went to, but his choice, his freedom to leave. You know, people bring that up, but with LeBron and those other guys, they sit up there and they lament that, and they do speak to disloyalty, and they don't do that with executives, and they don't do that with owners.
I want to address the racial component here, because there is a racial dimension to it, but I don't think it's independent of, or rather it's related to the idea that I brought up. In other words, this applies to labor generally in this country. One kind of means of control culturally is to tell labor, stay in your lane. Don't worry about your, Mr. So-and-so, the executive will figure that out. Now, the fact that oppression of African Americans and the institutional oppression that still reverberates and still exists in many respects.
The main institutional oppression that exists is the oppression of information. That's the main oppression, is the fact that when so-called black men and black women look in the history books, the few times that they do look in the history books, they're seeing lies. That's the main form of oppression, and that's the main form of mind control, to make the so-called black man in particular believe that his only history is slavery, and how they try to make the term black and the term slave congruent, and they're not. As a matter of fact, nothing could be farther from the truth. As I tell you brothers incessantly on this channel, the term slave is actually in reference to Southeastern Caucasians, because they were the slaves under the Byzantine Empire, which was governed over by so-called black men. All right, please don't take my word for it. Look it up. The term slave and the term Slav are the same term.
But certainly reverberates from this country's original sin, means that out of proportion to their numbers, African Americans will be in positions of labor versus management. And so in that way, it is especially racial. And it's also probably amplified whatever kind of bad feelings people have about labor taking their destiny into their own hands, especially when it's very well compensated labor, is probably amplified in their own minds if it's an African American subject we're discussing, an African American person we're discussing.
Max makes a good attempt at a point. Basically, what he's trying to convey is that there's a racial component to the divide between the worker and the owner. But what he's tacitly trying to imply is that a Caucasian worker is the recipient of the same treatment, the same sentiment as a so-called black worker, and that's just not the case. And that is what Stephen A. is trying to get across to the audience at large, is that a so-called black, quote-unquote, employee is expected to embrace a level of happiness to just be where he's at and be receiving a check, as opposed to a quote-unquote white employee who's oftentimes given more avenues to excel and to be quote-unquote promoted. And that's the angle that Mr. Max Kellerman is missing, but I expect him to miss that angle because he is a liberal Caucasian.
But I think that would apply to a white player too. Maybe not to the same extent, maybe yes. It would apply to a white player too if they tried to take their destiny in their own hands, join a super team, etc.
Not the same, not the same level of vitriol, and actually,
Maybe
as
not.
a result, Max, we can exactly. That's all I'm saying. It's not the same. I'm not saying it doesn't apply to folks that are white at all. I'm simply saying not to the same degree. And let's take into account what we just talked about the other day. The NBA, for example, who has an incredible record in terms of diversity and what have you, and should be applauded. Even in the NBA, what are we seeing right now? We're seeing a plethora of African American players. They make up about 74%. You take into account international players of color, that number jumps to 80% as it pertains to players. But the number of African American coaches have dissipated. The number of black executives have dissipated. Don't get me started with ownership, and not to mention the fact it's even gotten to the point where you're talking about reporters and what have you. The insiders, the people that executives communicate with, the people who are doing the hiring, the analytics dudes. It's white all over the place, and they're in positions of influence and power, and African American players are considered essentially laborers until LeBron James reminds them this is a different age and we're not going to be just that, which is why I applaud him coming out and speaking and reminding people of that.
I agree with most of what Stephen A. stated, because pretty much all he stated were facts that anyone can see who has two eyes. The problem with Stephen A., as usual, is that he can tell you that something is on your face, but he can't tell you how to remove it. The true issue is not the quote-unquote dearth of black coaches and black men in the front office. The issue is that, once again, I always touch on this, so-called black people don't want to form their own NBA or their own basketball league. And if you form your own basketball league, then you can have owners and you can have all-black front office. Let's be for real. Analytics is not going anywhere. You have to embrace the mastery of numbers, because numbers can reveal the formula for how to improve society and all aspects of society. If you don't embrace the use of numbers and formulas, you're going to be left behind. So you can't just go exclusively by the so-called eye test. Period. When you're talking about owners who are worth mega billions, they want to see on a piece of paper how you're going to make their team better. They want you to explain to them how you're going to make their team better. In other words, they want a formula. And there's nothing wrong with that. So the so-called black man in the front office has to embrace that. I guarantee you, Masai, whatever his name is, who works with the Toronto Raptors, I'm sure that he has a very, very firm stranglehold on the importance of analytics in regards to how it's going to affect his job future. You have to understand that if you don't, then you're going to be left behind.
And let's put it this way. Back in the day when there was the reserve clause in Major League Baseball, before integration, after integration, even when a white player would hold out, Mickey Mantle or Joe DiMaggio, why he makes $100,000 a year and I make $5,000. How dare, who does he think he is? It would likely have been worse if it was a black player, because then on top of everything else, you add the term back then, and maybe even now for some, uppity. There's this sense that you're not staying in your lane, and that...
Well, that term uppity is still in use. And even so-called blacks use that term uppity. Many so-called black people who oftentimes can't see the forest through the trees and get frustrated by black people who embrace their mental cognitive functions, they'll try to call you uppity. Why? Because they're jealous that you can see things that they either don't want to see or can't see. So that term is oftentimes used to try to demonize a so-called black person who actually has aspirations, not just from Caucasians, but also from other so-called black people as well.
That's compounded by race, I'm sure. I agree with that analysis. Quickly, I want to say about the Rockets, and bringing CP3 to Cleveland, Stephen A. I find that much less likely that LeBron could lure CP3 to Cleveland, a cold weather Rust Belt city, right? And a lesser team right now than CP3 could lure LeBron to a warm weather huge market in Houston that right now, if they added LeBron, I think would run roughshod over the West, including Golden State.
It's his hometown.
We know that, but I told you what the executives are talking about. They're talking about those two scenarios. Mm-hmm. That's what they're saying they believe is going on. I happen to believe if LeBron leaves, he's going to Houston, but we don't know whether or not he'll leave. It remains to be seen.
We shall see. And LeBron.
Yes, we shall see. I don't believe that LeBron will lure Chris Paul to Cleveland, but I do think that it would be better for LeBron if he were to lure Chris Paul to Cleveland rather than LeBron try to go down to Houston and play that three-point shootout style that Mike D'Antoni wants to play. I just don't see that from LeBron. Unless he agrees to be a hybrid of the Clint Capella role and go down low in the post and just be a guy who either shoots layups or kicks out for three. And also, please understand the impact that LeBron going to Houston would have on their salary cap. They would pretty much have to let go of all their shooters other than Chris Paul and James Harden. So we'll see. But anyway, LeBron James has been a transcendent figure in regards to promoting player mobility, and kudos to him. You have to be mobile, not just with your body, but also with your mind, with your aspirations. You got to be able to, be able to see things coming and be able to, to transition, or you will end up like a lot of the so-called black coaches and black front office people that Stephen A. laments about so much. You got to be mobile, not just with your body, but with your mind. You have to be ready to keep up with the Joneses, keep up with the times. You have to embrace analytics, even if that means you have to take a college course and learn about the importance of statistics and numbers. But anyway, peace.